So this talk is going to be about some hypotheses on burnout and stress in relation to hackers and the hacker mindset, and we'll discuss some of those terms in just a moment. For folks who don't know me, I'm Chris Sumner. Some people also call me Suggy. It's not a hacker handle, it was a nickname when I was 8 that just stuck forever. I've had other nicknames, some of them less complimentary, but that's the one I'll go with. And on Twitter, I'm at the Sugmeister. So you can follow me there. By day, I'm like a data scientist, something at HP, in HP security. But outside of work, I've got an interest in sort of behavioral psychology and how that relates to like online networks and what we do online. So I've done some research in that and didn't disgrace myself too badly with the psychology community. So from as you can tell from the accent as well, I'm not from Canada, I'm from the UK, so apologies for that. So I got interested in this particular talk because I'd seen a number of burnout-y sort of talks emerge over the last few years at security conferences. Not masses, but still, you know, it's bubbling under. And not too many of them have talked about, well, what might be causing that? You know, are there some factors that might be causing that? So I was really interested in the question of, well, so if there's a drinking game, by the way, for every time somebody says cyber, then you're going to roll out of here, you know, you're going to struggle to get out, personally. So I was looking at cybersecurity hackers, if you like. Do they have a greater risk of stress-related illnesses than their peers or sort of general society? And if they do, what might be contributing to that? So the first and obvious question we might want to sort of ask really is, well, what is a hacker mindset? And there are lots of sort of problems with this. One description that I've seen, and there are a few, and by the way, in the notes in this presentation, there's like copious notes with links to all the sort of studies and where I've got the information from. I'll make it all available so you don't have to take too many notes. So this was a description by Dr. Jessica Barker, who's involved in the UK security scene. And I liked her description because it was like a desire or ability to solve problems, be inquisitive, enjoy a challenge, poke around the rules or see where rules are illogical, with a tendency to have a systemic view of society. So I like that description of the hacker mindset. But thinking about it, it's like, well, does that then also apply to things like musicians and, you know, DJs or skateboarders or graffiti artists? And if anybody knows the skier in the picture, you know, then I'll happily buy you a drink later on. But you know, extreme skiers who are pushing the boundaries. So these are all sorts of very creative roles where people aren't bound or constrained by sort of societal sort of norms, really. So would those people, if we got some measure of hacker mindset, would those people end up on a hacker mindset scale as well? So yeah, they probably would. So the title of the talk is probably wrong, actually. So what is a hacker then in that case? Well, if I ask people to put their hands up in the audience, most people will self-identify as a hacker. I'm not sure whether I would or whether I wouldn't, but that in itself causes a problem for this sort of research. And there has been some research into hackers and personality traits and mental health and whatnot. One of them was by a lady called Dr. Bernadette Schell, and she did some research in 2002 at DEF CON. And there was this exchange between Brian Martin, Patricia or Jericho, as folks know him, and the professor. He's like, well, what is a hacker in your opinion? And her response was, well, hackers are a number of things. And at this point, no further definition or explanation was offered. So it creates a bit of a challenge because the term hacker and the term hacker mindset are very flexible depending on who you are. So I saw this post this morning, which gave me a little bit of a chuckle. Maybe it'll give some of you a bit of a chuckle as well. Dark circles around the eyes, stays up all night, eats junk. I'm not sure about cute, a little chubby possibly. I'll fight you. And I saw it, and then got the, you know, this image, and it gave me a chuckle. And I thought I'll put that in the presentation. I'm not sure it necessarily works, but it applies. So maybe raccoons are hackers as well. So for the purpose of this talk and the studies that I've done around this, I sort of looked at, well, what's the universe? So cyber again, so drink if you're doing that. So cybersecurity people, I didn't know how to really describe them, information security types, and a subset of that group are hackers, but as we've also seen, hackers could be in, you know, other spheres or other realms of society. But I was focusing on the group of people that we could all probably agree are hackers, and in order to do that, I solicited the input from 2 invite-only groups in the UK, where you're kind of invited to the group because people trust you and they, you think that you'll have something to contribute to their, if you like, security group. It wasn't an elitist group. I don't think that was ever the intention. It was more about a group for where people can trust each other, and that started, I don't know, maybe in the sort of the early 90s, so that people in pen testing sort of roles could share and trade information. So somehow I got invited to those 2 groups. I'm not quite sure how, but nevertheless. So I had access to 2 groups of people now in the UK, and I expanded that further with the London DEF CON chapter as well. So I've got a group that I could pretty much go with, well, this is probably what we mean by a hacker. So for the research or for the work that I've been doing, that's kind of how I defined the term. So more of that's in the slide notes. So back to the question. So are hackers at a greater risk of stress-related illnesses, mental health, what have you, than their peers in general society? And if so, what might be contributing to that? And to break that down in the flow of the presentation, what that will be is I want to look at, well, what do we already know about hackers and stress-related illnesses? How does that relate to other groups? Do the personality characteristics that are often attributed with hackers play some sort of role? Could they play a role? Could they inform our decision making where there's not enough research? How do those characteristics influence mental health? And why as why as a community should we care, and why as an industry should we care? So those are essentially the research questions, if you like. And the reason I labeled them as research questions is because I was planning or thinking about doing like a master's or a PhD and having a bit of a look at that. But the reality of time was such that I'm like, no, that's never going to happen. So if somebody else is here, I'll happily provide data, and maybe you can, you know, crack on with some master's research. So looking at these questions, what do we know about the industry? I've used kind of this model, which I've adopted from another paper called Dahlgren and Whitehead. And we look at sort of the interaction between a number of facets. One of them, or the first bit, is like lifestyle factors, mental health, physical health, and whatnot. So we see work and burnout are often commonly related. But lifestyle factors can involve relationships and exercise, and they can contribute negatively or positively to mental health and physical health. And burnout, I thought I'd like to expand that because it's often correlated or linked with depression, anxiety, and stress. There may be others, but I focused on those 2. So I'm going to talk about burnout first, and then what we know about stress, depression, all that sort of stuff. And I'll do it fairly quickly. So burnout's been labeled sort of, if you like, the state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. And really, if you like, the godmother of burnout is Christina Maslach, and she's defined that in kind of 3 facets: exhaustion, inefficacy or professional inadequacy, and cynicism. So those are the sort of 3 components that all gel together to create, if you like, burnout. So exhaustion. I feel emotionally drained at work. I feel tired when I get up in the morning, have to face another day on the job. I feel tired in the morning, pretty much every morning. Professional efficacy, the second dimension. I feel, in my opinion, I'm good at my job, and I feel exhilarated when I accomplish something at work. And then the final sort of dimension is around sort of cynicism. I've become more cynical about whether my work contributed anything, and I just want to do my job and not be bothered. So those are kind of the 3 elements, and these are just examples of sort of the Maslach questions. So what do we know about hackers? So there has been a study. It was conducted at B-Sides 2011, or just before B-Sides for presentation, 2011-ish, something like that. And the study, relatively small sort of sample, but they found this. Now the orange bar, the orange dashed lines are sort of medium levels of burnout, and the red lines are high levels of burnout. So what we can see here is that cynicism was quite high, but the rest not so much. Professional efficacy, there's lots of screens, so I don't really know which one to point at, is really rotated. So the lower you score in that, it's kind of the less burned out you are. So in relation to other groups, we can compare that, and we found that technologists, this comes from Maslach's own work, she found exhaustion, cynicism, and professional efficacy in technologists roughly like this, essentially. So it looks like as hackers, people who were involved in that particular server, they scored higher in cynicism. And we see that again if we look at a general population. So the trends are kind of there. Everything else, exhaustion, professional efficacy, about the same roughly, and cynicism much higher. And this kind of relates to what we might think stereotypically about hackers, and this quote, which wasn't related to the study, came up from InfoSec Taylor Swift. It was like, it seems like information security is professional cynicism, which I kind of liked. And then I really liked Simple Nomad's response to that tweet, where you spelt is fact as seems like. So I think, folks kind of tend to agree that cynicism is pretty high in hackers or information security. So to look at this myself, I adopted something called the Bergen Burnout Inventory 9. The reason I chose this inventory over Maslach is because it's free. Well, it was not necessarily free, but I emailed the author and they were like, yeah, sure, you can go ahead and use it. So the sample I had from the UK sample was 184 hackers. 169 were male and 15 were female. Now, that's a problem in terms of diversity for a start, because we can't really use the 15 females in the survey to establish anything about female hackers because the numbers are so low. So for the results I'm about to sort of share, we'll go with the 169 males. So what I found when I compared the results against Bergen Burnout's other studies where they've looked at other groups is that, again, we find like hackers scoring higher in cynicism, but in the other facets, if you like, they're scoring lower. Now, Bergen Burnout uses inadequacy rather than professional efficacy. So we can see that in the other dimensions, they're not doing too bad, really, our hacker group, but in cynicism, it's pretty high and, pretty second to engineering as a whole. So I'd say there is some, there are some legs to the discussion that cynicism is a thing. However, there's a caution with that, is that self-selection leads to unreliable survey outcomes. So it could all just be a whole load of nonsense. But we've now got two studies which have sort of, although not formal studies, that have indicated the same sort of thing. So it would be nice to see some more formal study that looks at burnout specifically in relation to hackers, or people who we can label as hackers, or information security as a wider group as well. So the other, or the next topic. So we looked at burnout. Essentially, we see that yes, there might be something there that's worth exploring. For stress, what do we know about hackers? Well, the only survey or study that I found about hackers is the Bernadette Shell work that was presented at DEF CON. It was a survey that was run in 2000 using samples of people who were attending both DEF CON 8 and HOPE. And she found mild but not pronounced stress presentations, so not too stressed. So inconclusive is what I'd say. But then if we look at programmers, and this could be, this is what I thought might be the closest link really, is that programmer stress is extremely common and extremely programmatic. That paper's from 1997, but maybe that's because programmers have got other sorts of stresses on them, so we don't really know. And all I can really say about stress, and I think all that anybody else can really say about stress in relation to hackers, is it's relatively unexplored, so there's an opportunity for research there. Then we move on to depression and really anxiety. We don't really know too much about that either, but there's a ZDNet article on that which seems to indicate that tech's relationship with depression is all well documented. So there is something there. There have been presentations, conference panels, and whatnot on that. So there could well be something there. So in looking at the stress-related illnesses, really in general, and I'm just picked burnout, stress, depression, I'd say there is some evidence that there are some relationships between our hacker group and elevated levels of stress, depression, anxiety, and burnout, but it requires research. So we've got our group, if you like, but maybe we can become more informed by looking at certain other characteristics and how they've been studied in other contexts regarding these, if you like, problems. So one of the things we wanted to look at maybe was well-being, and the reason we can use well-being is because it can offer an insight into how people feel without them having to be depressed or stressed, which is quite much more transitory, if you like. And well-being really is the subjective state of being happy, healthy, concentrated, comfortable, satisfied. And that, like burnout, is also in three categories. The first one being hedonic pleasure, so the presence of positive feelings, absence of negative feelings, overall satisfaction with life. Then we've got eudaimonic, that's like the dimension related to purpose, so that's all about autonomy, mastery, purpose in life, and what have you. And the third, if you like, facet of well-being is social acceptance, contribution, social actualization. So those are the three elements. And other studies have looked at the relation between well-being and depression, or at least looked at well-being as a screening method for looking at folks who may be more susceptible to depression. And they found these sorts of correlations. So definitely something there. So I wanted to sort of look at well-being because it might be a useful proxy when people aren't actually stressed, depressed, burned out yet, but might be in future. So what do we know about hackers? So using our hacker sample, I did find that there was a difference between well-being using the Warwick Edinburgh well-being scale, and I found that hackers, that's the shaded box, had lower levels of well-being than a health survey that was conducted across the UK. There are still problems with this as well, though. So you're getting the idea that there's lots of problems and emptiness in the research. Well, this is like the U-bend of life, it was termed in The Economist, and it shows that, as you get older to about age 50, 53, your well-being sort of tanks, really, presumably because you realize you've got to work for the foreseeable future, and there's no way out of that. And then it starts to improve, possibly as you're getting nearer to retirement, spiking in the 70s, 80s, when presumably you just don't give a shit anymore. I don't know, but it is interesting that I didn't find that in the hacker sample. I found almost like the opposite, really, in that well-being had seemed to improve with the samples. So we're really sort of scrabbling in the dark with this, but it might be useful for future research when we look at things like all of these facets and how they all sort of hang together. So possibly low well-being, but it needs a lot more research. So then we can go take a look at how personal characteristics that are associated with hackers or often associated with hackers might play a part. So these are some of the wider, if you like, determinants that might affect well-being, your lifestyle choices, your mental health and whatnot. It's genetic. I'm not going to touch on genetics. Childhood environment, I will talk about if I've got time. Personality, and what I've termed personality disorders because I couldn't put in pervasive personality disorders. So I'm going to look at the autism spectrum, and I'm going to look at personality using the big five predominantly. So the autism spectrum, folks are probably familiar with it, but there's a reasonable scale, if you like, that's been developed by this chap who's called Simon Baron-Cohen. If folks are familiar with Borat or Ali G as his brother, not Ali G's fictional brother, but Sacha Baron Cohen's brother. So there's a 50-question test which you can go and take on Wired, and I've got a test which will give you sort of the actual breakdown of the facets as well, which is included in the slide notes. So what's been found in relation to the autism spectrum quotient, which is this 50-question, if you like, test? Well, it's a scale 0 to 50. The red bar there indicates kind of the higher level or the sort of accepted cutoff, which might indicate that somebody has maybe got high functioning autism, like Asperger's syndrome, although there's some debate about that. Blue is kind of norm and yellow is maybe kind of averagey. So what we know about this in the general population is that males tend to score on average about 17, females about 15. With the cutoff being 32, it's not a hard cutoff. It just means, well, maybe you have a diagnosis and somebody qualified in this might go, oh yeah, well, this looks like Asperger's, or no, it's not. It's within norms. So it's an indication. If we look at the autism spectrum, it's broke down into sort of 5 main facets, or at least Simon Baron-Cohen's work has broke it down into 5 main facets. The first being attention to detail. I tend to notice more details, or I tend to notice details others do not. I notice in patterns in things all the time. The next facet is attention switching. So it upsets me if my daily routine is disturbed. Obviously, this is Rain Man, who kind of had to go and watch, what was it, Jeopardy or something like that. I can't remember the exact program he was watching, but if he didn't do that, he got pretty upset about it. The other element of attention switching is I frequently get so strongly absorbed in one thing that I lose sight of other things. And then this is kind of personal to me in some respects. It's like if there's an interruption, I can switch back to what I was doing very quickly. You can't switch back. That's the measure, if you like. It's reversed. So, I occasionally work at home, and you can have interruptions when you're working in the office. Say you are working on some hack or something which you're deeply focused in, and you get an interruption from your significant other or a colleague. Are you going to respond sort of like this and go, oh yeah, sure, I'll just switch over to chatting about that stuff immediately? Or is your response going to be a little bit more like this? Although that might not manifest itself like in actually shooting people, but you get the idea. It's highly frustrating because you're in the zone almost, and you have to get out of the zone. So the third facet of the autism spectrum is social skills. I don't find social situations easy, so you might prefer the library over a party. For instance. And then the fourth facet is around communication. So other people frequently tell me that what I've said is impolite, even though I don't think it's, or even though I think it's polite. So the final facet is around imagination. So I don't find it very easy to play games with children that involve pretending. And another question around that is that you might prefer the museum to the theatre. So those are the 5 facets, and those are essentially kind of how they're measured in those 50-odd questions. So an obvious question at this point is like, why do we care about looking at the autism spectrum in studying hackers? Well, we care because Tansom and Presswood here at least found that people with autism or Asperger's syndrome are particularly vulnerable to mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. One of my friends in the UK once said to me, this is a while ago, said having kids is like kryptonite to pen testers. Presumably, and this actually Steve Lord, by the way, gave me that wonderful phrase. But there is some evidence to support that, because you're hypersensitive, if you like, to the environment and the switching of tasks, if you like, which are particular to young children who, just off in all directions. And the noise, if anybody's been to a kid's birthday party, oh my God. Those are problems for people who score higher on the autism spectrum. Then we've got like relationships. So, marriage, for example, has been autism spectrum marriage, it's generally sort of less, less satisfactory, essentially. And then more recently, I found this piece of research that found that 66% of participants with Asperger's reported suicidal ideation. So there are a number of studies out there, far more than I've talked about here, that have linked positively correlated problems that people experience when they're sort of higher on the scale towards high-functioning autism. So that's why we care about looking at it, because it might, if we find that hackers are higher, then maybe that can give us some insights. So what do we actually know about hackers? Well, back to Bernadette Schell's work, this is kind of pervasive because it's one of the few studies that has really looked at this in any degree over the years. She looked at a number of conferences, Black Hat, DEF CON, HOPE, Exec Women's Forum, IBM, CASCON, with 136 participants. And if we go back to the model that we had earlier, sort of the graph, she found that for if you like, DEF CON and all of the other conferences there, the attendees scored higher, significantly higher, statistically significantly higher, with 20. And what I found interesting was both women and men scored 20, both the same, whereas in the other sample there was a difference between males and females. So I've looked at this with the sample that I had as well, with the if you like, the more narrowly defined hacker group in the UK, and I found that males, because we only had 15 female participants, got an average of 26. Of the 15 females, the mean score was 30, but you can take that or leave it because it's not a very big sample. In terms of the facets, and granted you can't read this, but it's attention switching, social skills, attention to detail, and what have you, I found significant differences in 3 of the categories. So attention switching is on the left, social skills next to it, and then communication skills on the right. Large differences, and I'll talk a little bit more about the relevance of that a little later. So then I also looked at, because I delivered the survey looking not just at how hackers scored in this, but the correlation between autism spectrum and burnout. And I first started looking at that in 2014, and I found a significant relationship between autism spectrum quotient and burnout. And then repeated the study in 2016, same methodology, and found almost exactly the same results. And then I repeated the study, but with the hacker sample, and found almost the same results. And then in breaking down the information, and you can't see this, it's just to show that I have sort of broken it down. It'll look by sex and by age groups, by study, and found, looked at all of the dimensions on burnout, and there were significant correlations kind of between all of them. So it was interesting to observe. And these are the facets that I found that were related to burnout. So ASQ, or autism spectrum quotient, and burnout these were the most significant relationships, and those are the relationships that also we see that are highest in our hacker sample compared to the norms. So I'd say that autism spectrum is probably really worth looking at in its relation to hackers and stress, health, and what have you. So moving on to personality, there are really sort of 2 big or 2 commonly used tools for this, depending on whether you're in a corporate environment or in academia, Myers-Briggs and the Big 5. Myers-Briggs doesn't tend to be used very much in academic research, but it's still going to be useful in the context of this sort of presentation. Further, there's been some work that's looked at correlations between Myers-Briggs types and the Big 5 traits, and I'm going to introduce those in a minute. So what I've done here is I've combined the Big 5 traits with the equivalent mapping to Myers-Briggs. So the first of the big 5 traits is openness, or intuition if you're Myers-Briggs, so creative, imaginous, curious, versus the opposite of that. Granted, it's not a UK audience, but this is conservative thinking. That's our Conservative Prime Minister, or was, and that's related to sensing. So that's the other end, more traditional view of the world, if you like. Then we've got conscientiousness or judging, so thorough, dependable, task focus, or the Robocop. And since it's a hacker conference, I got thinking, oh, hang about, ninjas possibly might fit into that bracket as well. So, if you absolutely have to, get somebody bumped off, then maybe you're looking for a ninja rather than Uncle Buck. But since it's a hacker conference, we've looked at this, so maybe pirates fit that bill as well. So this is the opposite of conscientiousness, and its Myers-Briggs type would be perceiving. So then we've got extroversion, so talkative, energetic, social, versus Milton from Office Space, introversion. I did get thinking last night in the bar that actually they both end up drinking cocktails on a deck chair at some point, so maybe they're not that different after all. The fourth trait that I'm going to look at in the big 5 was agreeableness, which is related to feeling in Myers-Briggs type. So this is trusting, kind, and helpful, in contrast to disagreeableness or thinking. So that's Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street, if folks don't know. So the final trait, and this is where Myers-Briggs has had some criticism, is neuroticism. And it had some criticism because it doesn't feature neuroticism in there, but it's really important for informing our view of hackers in the world. So these people are anxious, worried, easily ruffled as such, in contrast to the dude who probably has a more relaxed outlook on life in general. So why do we care about looking at personality? Well, openness or intuition is associated with high degrees of creativity, and researchers found that people who score higher in openness or are creative live in a more fluid and nebulous world, read stressful world. And there are studies that have found, a number of studies that have found repeatedly links between that and problems. So a little weird, prone to depression, blame your creative brain. So that's why we're interested in openness. Unconscientiousness, perceiving, I've not added too much in here, but I did read a survey that showed that, if you want to live longer, you're better off being conscientious than unconscientious. So they die sooner. Introversion, there's been some studies that have looked at the role of Big 5 versus burnout, and they found like greater cynicism in introverts, lower efficacy, and also in another study, lower overall well-being. Agreeableness, more cynicism, lower efficacy. And neuroticism, greater cynicism, greater exhaustion. I mean, neuroticism is really related to a whole bunch of stress-related sort of issues. So what do we know about hackers as a group? Well, there's been, if you like, a survey on Hacker News. I can't recall which year it was from now, actually, off the top of my head. It might have been like 2008 or something like that. The white unshaded boxes are the numbers from Myers-Briggs traits, if you like, from general society, and the numbers or the bars in solid black are the findings that the Hacker News survey found. So it was like stark difference, if you like. And what I did to try and make that easier to look at, I tilted that on its side and put it with the big 5 traits that related to it, and to make that even easier to read. We've got that up there now. Yeah, so agreeableness, the orange bars are the hackers, the black bars are the general society. So the orange bars are less agreeable in that 2008 study versus the general population, massively so. And then in terms of openness, the creativity piece, the hacker sample were off the frickin' scale, basically, compared to the normal general society. I shaded out extroversion because I didn't think that the gap was that exciting. It sort of is, but and conscientiousness was about neck and neck. In addition to that, Shell also looked at one of the facets of openness, creativity, measured on a scale here, Durbin scale, 0 to 20, with 15 being highly creative, and in her sample she found that hackers or people that in her sample at DEF CON scored 15.3. So creativity was kind of something we'd expect from hackers. So I did the sample of the personality study with the group from the UK security community. This isn't particularly easy to read, so what I did is I twisted that kind of on its side a little bit, put it next to the graphics, then we can overlay that and see where it is. So what we can find now is that the hackers were more, actually I can do a little bit better job at that. So the hackers were more, scored, all of these traits were significant statistically in the sample. So more open, less conscientious, more introverted, more, if you like, disagreeableness, and more neurotic. And I thought, it'd be a neat idea to sort of label these boxes as different colors for if they were related to other studies that I found, like mental health, stress-related issues. And by the time I'd done that, I just didn't bother changing the red because they all were essentially. What I would say, though, is that as the age group got higher, the statistical significance on introversion and extroversion disappeared in the sample that I had. So, that was about the same. And Shell concluded, Bernadette Shell, who's, research from 2000, she said, really, it stands to reason that creative people would experience episodes of mania and depression, what have you. Highly creative and successful people in the arts, sciences, and business are, in various degrees, mood disordered. This was cited in some of Shell's work. So how am I doing for time? I've got a minute. So childhood, I'll just skim over, but there's plenty of notes. There's been a massive study in childhood, adverse childhood experience, it's called. So essentially, if you start at the bottom of an adverse childhood, it affects neurodevelopment, then social, emotional, cognitive impairment, relates to a whole bunch of health related issues, resulting ultimately in greater propensity for disease, early death, and such like. So it's a real issue. And they've also found that adult well-being is strongly linked to childhood experiences. So, I might make this easier to read. So over on the right, you've got childhood happiness. They're all scoring a lot higher in well-being to where it was low. Now, adverse childhood doesn't have to be sort of sinister necessarily. It could just be that maybe the environment you grew up in was a little bit rough and you had to sort of watch what you were saying, otherwise you get your head kicked in. At least that's kind of the case in the UK, really. Or maybe you had like a more solitary sort of childhood experience, and maybe you didn't want to have a solitary, but were kind of forced to be in there. There's been other research that's looked at social groupings as well. So being part of a group or being accepted as a group, all of these things can influence people's childhood, and that relates to mental health. So why did I put it in here, and what do we know about hackers? I put it in here because Bernadette Shell looked at this as well. I didn't look at it, but Bernadette Shell did. And she found in her study almost a third of the hacker respondents saying that they had experienced childhood trauma or significant personal losses. So it's possible that our hackers have had less desirable childhoods than their peers, possible as a whole group. So what we've done here, we've looked at some of the wider determinants, and those who we've found consistently, I guess, although it needs a lot more research, that the survey results of this Hacker News sample mirrored what we saw in our sample, like spot on, actually. I didn't think that would happen. And all of these things have been related to increased chances of having stress-related issues in later life. Now, what I'm not saying is that's going to be massive, but maybe a little bit. So the conclusion of that part of the talk is that I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that hackers would be at greater risk, maybe slightly, of experiencing burnout and stress-related illnesses than a general population. And by that, I mean that if we think that, or if we say for argument's sake that general population are maybe 25% of people are going to experience episodes of stress, depression, or what have you, within their lives. Maybe for the hacker sample, it's, I don't know, 25 to 35%. Who knows? I'm not saying you're a hacker, you're going to be stressed or depressed. What I'm saying is that maybe it nudges the bar up a little bit. So elements that I've not discussed, but I think are really interesting is flow, for example. If you're in the zone work-wise, you're going to feel pretty damn good about yourself. Attachment styles, which may also be related to your sort of childhood experience, how you grew up, your parenting. Authoritarianism, which is like heavily linked with like ideology and whatnot. Found that to be particularly interesting looking at different samples in elections. Personality disorders that are commonly associated with hackers, like bipolar or other anxiety disorders, ADHD and what have you, and kind of related to that, alcohol and drug use / abuse as maybe as a coping strategy. And also the interactions between different types, the personality relationships, if you like. So do they cause a problem? We also live in or work in an environment that's rapidly changing, not just the technology, but if you're in an organization changing all the time, socioeconomic issues, imposter syndrome, and there's a really nice TED talk about connectomes as well that's looking at that. So kind of the concluding part of the work I was looking at really is like, well, why should we care? Why does this even warrant studying? Well, first of all, it could benefit the community. If you like, self-help, being more aware of, whether you're on these, whether you're higher up in terms of autism spectrum, what your childhood was, maybe all those sorts of things can help actually go and sort of tackle, your own problems. I remember it was like Christmas Day a few years ago. My wife was like, "Oh, well, maybe you're Asperger's," and I was like, "What?" So I cranked out, Christmas Day, I got the autism spectrum quotient thing up and went through it. I was like, holy shit, yeah, I'm pretty high. Didn't expect it, but knowledge of that is like, well, that all adds up now, actually. Why I find kids' birthday parties like the most stressful environment ever. Hiring and work environment. I had a really good chat with a lady who's a recruiter. I know that sounds like, sort of like, what, a recruiter? But she was really interested because she's trying to get organizations to understand that maybe they have to treat the interview process and all of that slightly differently, and they could be missing out on really good talent because of the communication ability through CVs and interviews. And around the same time, there's this program on the BBC, which you may be able to find on YouTube, called Employable Me. It's like you might need to treat some of these people that you want to attract into the organization differently. And there's a cybersecurity skills crisis, so you really need to be thinking about that if you're on the organizational side. And not only is there a skills shortage, but a lot of people who started in security are looking at retirement now, and presumably their well-being is going up. So you want to try and keep those people, within the organization, keep the people that you have got in the organization. The other thing here is communicating with the business. I don't know how many talks I've been to where it says like security people need to be able to communicate better with the business. It's like, well, it might be actually that the business need to understand and appreciate a little bit more about, hackers and learn how to communicate or get the best out of hackers, maybe some sort of translator. A better understanding of the people that work in these environments. Maybe they're, you might have an interaction with somebody who's, if you like, a hacker in the organization. You think, my God, they're a bit prickly. But maybe that's not, maybe they don't hate you. Maybe it's just their way of communicating, So there are a number of, I think, things that are important that could stem from knowing a little bit more about all of these issues. So I kind of wrap this up by saying that, well, if you think you're struggling in any of these sorts of things, then, employee assistance programs generally available in lots of organizations, obviously GP and doctor, talking therapies, whatnot, campaign against living miserably. There's some resources out there, and I encourage folks to look into them if you are struggling. But if you're looking to read about more on this subject, then there are a range of books by a chap called Oliver James, who's looked at things like Britain on the Couch, affluenza. They Fuck You Up, which is about people's childhood experiences, essentially. In terms of personality, there's a great book called Quirk by Hannah Holmes. In terms of personality and cybersecurity as a whole, Kerwin and Power have probably done the most work there, and then like Asperger's syndrome, like Tony Attwood's work. So I think I might have just about brought this home on time to catch us up for the next speaker. But just hypotheses, just ideas, but it seems to have some merit. So thank you.